A new DC film to review. I'll be right on it. Wait a minute. This feels kind of different. I mean, not totally different, but kind of different. Unnecessary inclusion of F words? Tom. Oh, sorry. Fuck. Oh my god. Christian iconography that's incredibly ham-fisted. Ugh. Desaturated colours. I will never finish my Rubik's Cube. It's okay, it's just the aspect. I think I know what we're dealing with here. We're in the Snyder Cut. Oh god, what do we do now? It's okay, don't panic. All that we need to do to get out of this is do a 4-hour video. It'll drag on forever. Look, we'll do it in 6 parts. You won't even notice. Yes, we will. You will.
So begins the end.
After years of campaigning, the Snyder Cut is finally released. I'm not going to say anything negative, because DC fans scare me. All jokes aside, let me start by saying how cool it is that Zack Snyder actually got to complete his creative vision. Just from an artistic perspective, it's nice that he got to finish what his vision for Justice League was. And I'm so happy for all the fans who really fought and campaigned to make this happen. I mean, they've been rewarded with not just the film, but also the fact that the general consensus for the movie is that it's pretty good. They've been vindicated that this is far superior to the 2017 film. And I say all of that with in mind that personally for me, I was still kind of underwhelmed by Zack Snyder's Justice League. I was so prepared to eat my words on this one because I've been pretty negative of Zack Snyder's DC output, even though I quite like Man of Steel. I did not like Batman v Superman at all. So this was sort of a toss-up, and it's hard to pinpoint exactly where it didn't click for me. I don't know, was it anticipation or hype from positive word of mouth? Maybe it was because I'd seen the 2017 cut relatively recently for comparison's sakes. But regardless, to me it just didn't feel like a big enough improvement over the 2017 cut of the film. Now I've seen a lot of people sort of holding it up as saying, hey, it's better than the 2017 cut of the film. Which it is. But to me, that's not a big selling point or a major win, because of course you can tell a more complete and coherent story in 4 hours as opposed to 2. So the question then is the film good on its own merits? And at least to me, not really. It's not bad, but it's sort of aggressively average. And when you factor in the gargantuan running time, the amount of hype behind it, and the fact that this is what we got, it was never going to be anything more than a bit of a disappointment for me. All that being said, I want to start with some positives. One thing that this cut does incredibly well is that it adds in some great elements, most of which is character stuff. And while some people have kind of disliked Snyder's characterization in previous efforts, I feel like he finds a good balance here, and generally speaking, he serves the characters pretty well. But if there's one character that benefits from added backstory and development more than any other character, it has to be Cyborg. He was done a real disservice in the theatrical cut, and here he absolutely steals the show. They give him enough development and emotional heft that you really get invested in this character, to the point that he actually feels like a fleshed out character as opposed to the plot point from the 2017 cut of the film. Snyder salvages Cyborg to the point that Ray Fisher and any of the scenes he's in is a highlight, and to be honest, probably the best thing about the movie. While Cyborg is perhaps the most notable character to be developed, there's plenty of other characters that are also just given a bit more to do in the Snyder Cut, and also plenty of other characters introduced. So characters that are a bit more developed include Silas Stone, Lois Lane, Jim Gordon and Alfred. New characters include the likes of Ryan Choi, Iris West, of course Darkseid, and also there's a few characters introduced that I'll say nothing about that are also in the film. I won't ruin them for spoiler reasons, but some of these characters are done more justice than others, but it's very clear there's a lot more world building going on in Zack Snyder's Justice League. Another big positive is Junkie XL's score from the film, which is a massive step up from the uninspired music of the original cut. Even though at times it takes itself maybe a little bit too seriously, sometimes it kind of feels like anytime Wonder Woman is on the scene, we just get this obnoxious chanting, which just becomes parody at a certain point. Ah! The nightmare scene, which I'll talk about in a bit more detail later on, is pretty cool. I really like the character interactions, especially between Batman and Joker. I'm not a big Jared Leto fan, but I think his portrayal of Joker, even in this short scene, is already superior to his previous effort. Of course, some scenes appear in both cuts of the film, and there's definitely no scene in this cut that is worse than the 2017 cut, but there are actually some scenes that are better. For example, the scene where Superman take on the rest of the League is still a highlight. It's intact here and even extended a bit. Then it comes to the recruiting of the team. While at times maybe a little bit of a slog, it does at least feel less rushed and allow for the characters some time to breathe, and because of that we get some pretty good character moments, but I do think it could have still benefited from being trimmed a little bit. The big action ending, while perhaps being a little mundane and familiar in its broad strokes, does at the very least have the time here to set up its stakes, so it does have a bit of a more grandiose and epic feel to it. Some of the more substantial changes to the film do occur in this last act, and there's some pretty cool visual moments and interesting ideas, even if they perhaps feel a little bit superfluous. And while it doesn't manage to undo the fact that Superman being part of the League basically makes the rest of the League irrelevant, they do at least manage to make the defeat of Steppenwolf feel a little bit more like a team effort. The story in general does have a slightly more operatic and large-scale feel to the thing, helped of course by its mammoth running time and big action and effect sequences, which make this at least feel like the worthy blockbuster that it was always meant to be. They also managed to find some time to give our villain some much needed motivation and development. That being said, in those two regards, I feel like it's not a big enough improvement. The plot is still very MacGuffin heavy, and by the time the story sort of settles down after the recruiting part, it all feels a little bit trite. As much as Steppenwolf has a bit more development, he's still a pretty shallow villain, even though he is a bit more intimidating here, if only physically. That brings me to some of the problems with the film, because as much as a lot of stuff here is new and improved, not everything is salvageable. For example, Ezra Miller as the Flash is still really awkward, and those quips that we all thought were Joss Whedon, they're in here and they're just as bad as you remember. There's also scenes that just don't feel necessary or warranted. For example, Flash again has a scene where he saves Iris West, which, yeah, it's a successful bit of world building, but you wouldn't even know it was Iris West unless you knew the actress was playing Iris West, for one. Also, it's just a weird and awkward scene in general. It adds nothing, feels totally unnecessary. It's only there because they wanted to give Flash a hero introduction scene. The effects are also wildly inconsistent. Firstly, the redesigned Steppenwolf is incredibly overwrought, and also his face doesn't look all that menacing. In fact, at times he kinda looks cute. He reminded me of the pufferfish in Finding Nemo for some reason. Then we have Darkseid, who is decent overall, but doesn't really live up to his potential visually as the big bad of the DC universe. And then we have Cyborg, who at times looks unfinished. Probably the worst example, though, of effects is the epilogue, which kind of reeks of awkward green screening and at times just doesn't look right. This is very much a Zack Snyder film, though, which if you're a fan of his is a real treat. Whereas if you're not, some of his tropes can be a little grating. For example, visually, the film is quite dull looking due to the colour grading. Some of the dialogue can be a bit wooden or stilted when it's trying to be profound. The script also seems like it focuses sometimes on moments as opposed to telling a story that's actually engrossing. And then one of the bigger problems is the film is so engorged that scenes of any importance or actual substance struggle to stand out. While others might disagree, this felt like every bit of the 4 hours to me, especially when done in one continuous viewing. It didn't really feel like the best of the Zack Snyder Justice League scenes. It felt like all of the Zack Snyder Justice League scenes. Like there was nothing wasted. Ironically, it actually feels like if the studio had been a bit more involved, they would have been able to cut this into something that was a bit tighter as opposed to how flabby this actually is. We have a film here whose structure and plot is largely the same, and while the added development does make the characters and action have a bit more weight, the unnecessary inclusion and the incredible length slows the film down and makes it a bit turgid. While it does certainly pick up a bit of momentum coming into the ending, it isn't altogether a satisfying ending all the same. Most offensive in this regard is the nightmare scenes, which as I mentioned are relatively cool and interesting, but only stand there to show off what could have been in Justice League sequels that will probably never come to pass. Not helped by this feeling is the fact that it's lazily introduced in a dream scene of no real substance, and it really just gives the feeling that this isn't there to affect the story or anything in that regard. It's just there to say, wouldn't it be cool if... The final scene, which is also touched upon earlier in the film, has that same feeling about it. It just really feels like an example of unnecessary fan service, like Zack Snyder read some fan theories and said, yeah, well, let's put that in. It feels unnecessary. I don't think it makes a lot of sense, but I'm sure it'll satisfy some people for its inclusion. Overall, Zack Snyder's Justice League is an indulgent exploration into what could have been. But it's hard to escape what already has been. I mean, comparing it to the 2017 cut, it is the superior film. But when viewed in isolation, at least personally, I still feel like it's not a good movie. While there's plenty to like, there's plenty of stuff I also just felt indifferent over. They took a flawed and fractured film and made it flawed and whole. And while it certainly fixed some of the problems, there's still some very evident issues in this film that just meant that it wasn't very enjoyable. The exorbitant length of the film does it no favours, and while it does take time to do right by the characters, nonetheless it makes for a viewing experience that will test your endurance. If nothing else, it will cause you to question how the hell they ever managed to make a somewhat coherent 2-hour film out of this back in 2017. And it will also cause you to question what the hell Zack Snyder would have done to make this work sans an extravagant director's cut. Then again, Zack was given the unenviable job of getting the characters to this point when they didn't all have the benefit of a solo film to develop naturally, and with all that in mind, it's no surprise the film came out this way. All that said, fans of his work and his vision for the DC Universe should probably rejoice, because this is the most even, extravagant and auteur of Zack Snyder's DC films, and while it's not to everyone's sensibilities, the nature of his work has always been rather divisive. So on those merits alone, I implore you to check it out and draw your own conclusions, because if nothing else, in an age where we constantly see the strains of the studio blockbuster and forced franchises, there is at least something refreshing to seeing a director's unfettered vision come to life, even if it wasn't all you hoped it would be. I think that's Wonder Woman. Jesus.